Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Those of you who are watching this and listening, this is the first webcast from the Lennart Meri Conference. I'm Toomas Ilves, and I'm very pleased to have my former colleague from Stanford here, Frank Fukuyama, who's one of those guests who probably needs no introduction whatsoever. Because of all of the things he's written over the years. As an introduction, I read The End of History in its original essay form in 1989. I was so bowled over by it. I immediately made a photocopy and had someone sneak it into Estonia. By the time that they had translated, things had moved so quickly that it was no longer anything that anyone was really afraid of anymore. But certainly when it appeared, it was not that popular with the ruling regime. And before we start getting into it, because you, Frank, are known all over the world, but especially here in Europe for that essay, even less so, more than the book, is that the word "the end" and the end of history, which has brought no end of straw man attacks. I just wanted to quote here from your book, which we'll be talking about. The word end was meant not in the sense of termination, but target and objective. Karl Marx has suggested that the end of history would be a communist utopia, and I was simply suggesting that Hegel's version, where development resulted in a liberal state linked to a market economy, was a more plausible outcome. Well, that's not how most people have taken it. Most recently, I would recommend to those people who take an interest in this is a great essay by Aris Rousinos called "Fukuyama Was Right All Along," which I do recommend to people. But today I think we'll start off talking about Frank Fukuyama's most recent book, Identity, which I think personally is a tour de force of the history of ideas, or more properly, the history of a concept or an idea, identity, and how it has developed over time, and also a concept that has grown in force and impact to the point that so much of our politics today around the world, but especially in what we still call the liberal democratic world, has been almost overturned. And I thought maybe we'd start by you just talking how you came to write the book and why you decided to do it.
Sure. Well, thanks for having this discussion, Thomas. It's good to see you again. The book really was triggered by the Trump election and the Brexit vote in 2016, because all of a sudden you saw two of the world's oldest, most established democracies voting in populist leaders following a populist agenda. And it struck me that this was something that needed to be unpacked. And I thought that actually the concept of identity is really central in understanding what had happened. There's been a debate over the trigger for this rise of populism, not just in those two countries, but in Hungary and Poland and Brazil and many other places.
Even here in Estonia.
And including in Estonia. And I think that the dominant explanation has tended to be economic, that it's a result of this kind of hyper-globalization we've had that has created inequality, created a narrow oligarchic elite in many countries, and then left working classes, traditional working classes, stagnating or going backwards in many respects. And so that's fair enough. I mean, that has happened, but that doesn't really explain why it was the right-wing populists rather than the left-wing ones that then came to power or became big political actors in many different countries, because traditionally it's the left that offers real solutions, through more redistribution, taxation of rich people, benefits, social benefits and the like. but instead you had the rise of these right-wing parties. And I think that that really does have to do with identity, that the left, in a way, is kind of open to the world and universalistic, whereas the right offers identity. It offers national identity. It made the argument that the liberal elites were diluting national identity. They were bringing in foreign ideas, foreign workers, outsourcing employment, and diluting national cultures. And I think that that was a very powerful message that helped explain to many working class people, especially, that why they were suffering, that it really was this onslaught of a conspiracy between the elites and foreigners that was leading to their particular crisis. And this is why immigration, for example, and borders have been, central to almost every populist party around the world. Now, that's actually hardened in the United States. I'm not so sure that in Europe, in a place like Germany, the situation's been getting worse, but it's definitely been getting worse in the United States, where identity has, hardened into a kind of loyalty, a sort of tribal loyalty that has overridden individual rationality and economic self-interest to a remarkable degree. So, for example, in the United States, wearing a mask is not regarded as a health decision that you take, to protect yourself and others. It's taken as a political statement. And, if you like Trump, you don't wear a mask, and if you dislike Trump, you do. And that's a kind of example of identity, being the central driver of our politics. But I'm afraid that that's really what's been threatening liberal democracy in many parts of the world.
Yeah, it's not the mask wearing sort of division strike me as being kind of evolutionarily probably not the best idea in terms of expanding your electorate. No. But actually, the economic argument that you argue against, actually, I've looked at it also from a slightly different point of view, but actually, first of all, in Europe, there has been no noticeable change in over the past 10 years in income inequality. The Gini coefficient, which is a measure of, as you know, of income inequality, has basically remained the same. But you see this sudden outburst or upwelling of populist sentiment in places where really the income distribution has not changed so much, but there is a lot more of a dissatisfaction. And in the case, the economic argument makes actually least sense in the United States, since the policies of the Trump administration, in fact, have increased income inequality by dramatically reducing taxes on the rich and not really offering any kind of relief to the middle class or the poorer people. I wish I were in that tax bracket that has millions of dollars because they're paying far less than the middle classes in the United States. So it's so that argument really is, in this case, it is not economic, and it really has to do with these, well, again, with the rise of these other feelings, which have led to changes in governments in those two countries, but also we see in Hungary and Poland, we see a rise of this. Interestingly enough, it is also not something that is tied strictly to, say, Western liberal democracies, but in fact you see the same, an appeal to the same concepts even in countries that were never in the liberal democratic fold. You see actually, I think, a quite concerted push by Vladimir Putin to develop this kind of, develop the Russian national identity as a kind of in opposition to liberal democracy, mainly in Western Europe. And these are, well, it's all, for me, rather scary, is that you end up with kind of this international of nationalists. where and we saw a year ago at least, and continuing until he was arrested for fraud, Steve Bannon trying to develop a center in Italy, here in Europe, that would bring all of the hard right nationalists together to create kind of a school or a seminar of European nationalists, which is, I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of logically a rather bizarre way to go, is to create across Europe each nationalists from each country, which I think is kind of not a great idea, and precisely what in the past has led to all kinds of wars. So you wrote this, and tell me, how have you been opposed? The reaction?
Well, so the story is a little bit complicated, and it depends on the audience. In many ways, I got my best audience in Germany because I was arguing that in Germany and other European countries, they had become de facto, quite diverse. There's this almost same proportion of foreign-born people in Germany now as there are in the United States. And, I've heard Germans over the years constantly say, we're not a country of immigration like you Americans, we have our, different traditions, but the fact is they are. And I think that they're still embedded in their citizenship laws, and even in the way they use the adjective Deutsch. It does have a very specific ethnic content. And, one of the arguments that I was trying to make was that they needed to rethink that and have a more democratically based and open sense of national identity that built it around political institutions like democracy and freedom, rather than maintaining that kind of ethnic sense of what it meant. So that was one audience in Europe. In the United States, it's a very different situation, I think largely because of our racial history. And there, I would say that the situation has gotten much more divided and intense along exactly the lines that I was describing in my book. It was the case up until the 1980s, at least, that American politics could be measured along the left-right axis, measured by economic policy, right? That the right was pro-capitalist, pro-market. They wanted limited government, and the left wanted more redistribution, stronger government, and so forth. And that today, I think, has been displaced by an axis that is more defined by identity. And so the Republican Party is the anti-immigration party. It's become increasingly the party of white nationalism. President Trump has made increasingly open appeals, saying essentially that white people are threatened in this country by the Democrats, who represent these out of control, violent minorities. And it reflects an underlying reality that the voter bases of the two parties have shifted. I think that you can see this just in the U.S. Congress, that of the Republicans in Congress, both senators and representatives, only about 6 of them represent any kind of minority group, whereas in the Democratic Party, about 40% are, members of different racial and ethnic minorities. And, frankly, that's not a good way to organize your politics, because you can't do anything about your race or ethnicity. You can argue about whether taxes should be higher or lower, but when it comes down to these kind of existential fear, and this is a common trope now on the right, that they won't replace us, that's really the fear, that what's really going on in the policy decisions being made by elites is the desire to replace essentially this kind of white traditional America with something different. And that raises the temperature of politics, and I think it puts us in this really awful situation facing an election in November, where both sides, I think, regard the outcome as a kind of existential crisis for the values that they believe in.
Well, what seems to two things. One is that, in fact, the group that supports Trump seems to have, there are two, it's a bimodal distribution. You have white, uneducated men, or men without college, and then you have very rich people. We're also white generally, but anyway, the support comes from those two groups, whereas, women, men with college education tend to support Biden at this point. But the other element in this also seems to be a willingness to abide by rule of law, which is in the last several weeks, I'd say for a while now, but now, really in the last several weeks has come to the fore when you see the President of the United States saying, well, we'll see if we have a peaceful transition of power, and the complete unwillingness of the Republicans in Congress to actually comment on this. And this is, if you begin to associate your political views with a commitment to rule of law, then I think we're really in trouble. Or you are, but the rest of us, given what will happen with the transatlantic alliance and relations is one reason why I think all of Europe is looking very, very closely to what will happen to this election. And from our point of view, of course, anyone saying, well, we'll see what we do depending on the outcome is something that really scares a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic.
No, it should really scare everybody. And this, I think, shows the power of identity, that if you think that protecting your identity is the most important thing, then rules don't matter, institutions don't matter. If the outcome is not going to be favorable to your identity or your team, then you'll do what it takes, to stay in power or to keep power. And yeah, you're right. Going back to Trump's impeachment earlier this year, he was clearly guilty of the things that he was accused of. He tried to extort President Zelensky of Ukraine to help his election campaign. There's just no question that this had happened. And yet, only Mitt Romney, of all of the 53 Republican senators, was willing to vote in favor of impeachment because of that kind of loyalty. And, many of them knew that he was guilty. They were not
they knew,
true believers. But, again, that's kind of the power of identity to override kind of, well, first of all, rationality, but also, commitment to institutions and democratic principles. And I think that is the crisis that we face. And yes, you're absolutely right that in foreign policy, it's going to have big implications. John Bolton, who, I've disagreed with on lots of issues over time, the former national security advisor, said pretty clearly that he does not expect NATO to survive a second Trump term, and I think that's not going to be good for anybody.
Well, I know that many NATO allies breathed a sigh of relief on the 21st of January this year, because there was a clause that if you're going to leave NATO, you have to give a year warning. And so January 21 came in and said, whew, okay, maybe we have a chance of saving it. Well, what's interesting, just a couple of points. One, you mentioned Germany. What is really intriguing is that after the really cataclysmic for many sort of democratic, liberal democratic parties in Europe, given the immigration issue, when when Angela Merkel decided to take up to 1 million refugees, that in fact 5 years later, it turns out that 80% of Germans think it was a good idea, and they find it they're very pleased that in fact they have new people. There's a traditional problem in Germany already, going back to Günter Grass about, Germans dying out. Well, in fact, they do have very low birth rate, This is what led, in fact, to the Turkish Gastarbeiter 50 years ago. But indeed, now you've got 1 million extra people out of 82 million, and it turns out they adapt and assimilate, if not completely ethnically, at least in terms of the German work culture, linguistic culture, and you will now meet people in Germany who are basically from Syria, but the kids are already speaking perfect German. I mean, we've actually had the same case here. We do not have very many Syrian refugees here because they prefer to go to Germany. But I remember seeing an interview here last year where there were 2 kids who were from Syria who were speaking, went to Estonian school, were speaking perfect, accentless, grammatical, sophisticated Estonian. All right, their parents spoke English, but they spoke wonderful Estonian. I mean, that this process actually can go quite quickly, and I think it's great that, in fact, Germany has had this experience. I wish other countries would see it too, because in so many countries, virtually every country in Europe today, you see this card being played by populists, and this is. But in the U.S., yes, I mean, we can maybe talk a little bit about one of the other things that I've, in your writing, and which has actually influenced me in my own thinking about the decay of democracy and the importance of institutions in maintaining democracy, and what if you're just observing the U.S., maybe the last couple of years, but ever since Attorney General Barr, and most recently, I mean, I guess it seems to be a kind of a even sped up decline, accelerated decline when it comes to rule of law, especially now with, the most recent statements about, well, we'll see whether we have a peaceful transition. But now, is there a correlation? Are they related? Or is the decline of institutions a result of the, as you suggested a while back, that maybe, the identity becomes more important than the institutions? I don't know, how do you see that?
Well, I think there's a lot of different sources. The decay of institutions really began way before Trump. I think that, the American system is very difficult to change. The Constitution has these extremely high supermajority requirements for amendment, and so it's only been amended less than 30 times in the history of the Constitution, and not any time in the last several decades, because that bar is so high. And there's many things, I think, if you're doing it over again, that you would probably want to change. The first one is the Electoral College. That's the problem that we're facing right now, that there's a kind of anti-majoritarian bias built into the Constitution that overrepresents small states. And so California, with 40 million population, has 2 senators, and Montana, with less than 1 million, has 2 senators. So there's that issue. I think that apart from the Constitution, you're kind of trapped in this bad equilibrium. Let's say, talk about money in politics, which I think most Europeans, when they look at the American system, are kind of aghast at how easy it is for rich people, to buy influence in American politics. And that becomes a problem that is very hard to solve, because those same, oligarchic forces can block Congress from actually trying to change the rules that give them that kind of sway. And I think this is something that's been going on for the last 20 years, that people increasingly feel that Congress is not representative, that it's really being manipulated by these different interests. It depends on whether you're on the left or the right. If you're on the right, you think is being swayed by Hollywood and
Soros.
George Soros. And if you're on the left, it's corporations and so forth. And the problem is that there's truth to that. And the Supreme Court, has kind of opened the way to making this a more open practice. So it's that combination of rigidity and the inability of the system to really self-correct that I think is at the root of the problem. Now, one thing that must be said is that, in contrast to these president for life countries like China has become, there is still one big check that exists, and that's an election. We are going to have an election, and there'll be an opportunity for the American people to decide. Hopefully, they will be allowed to make that decision, without undue manipulation. And if that, goes the right way, I think, there's some hope of correcting some of these deep-seated problems. But this chicken and egg thing, I mean, do the bad institutions create the identity problem, or does the identity problem, undermine the institutions? I think actually the causality goes both ways. And you can see instances where identity is weakening institutions, and then you can see for example, our first past the post voting system.
I was just about to get to that. I was just going to get to that.
Yeah.
Because, the UK and the US are already have first past the post voting system. So does Hungary, in part. And you end up with this binary choice. And what I see happening in both the UK and the United States is that the identity merges with the two parties that exist. Whereas in other countries, you may have the identity issue does not become, identical to or identified with one political party versus the other. And so, I've thought for years that a proportional system, given the general tendencies of first past the post systems, or majoritarian, or first winner take all, is that you move away from the center, because in order to get into your party's mainstream, you have to move away from the center. Whereas when you have a proportional system, then you're more likely to win or to form a coalition when you are more toward the sort of Gaussian sort of normal curve where most people are, but instead we have in the US and in the UK around Brexit, you have this bimodal distribution where everyone gets more towards moves toward a radical position. But I certainly see the sort of two-party system as being, and its identification, as it were, with identity as a real problem for the US and for the UK.
It's been exacerbated also by the introduction of popular primaries that started after Watergate in the 1970s. So the theory of it, sounds good, but in reality, the only people that vote in party primaries are activists. They're very low turnout elections, and the only people motivated are the ones that are really committed. And on both the right and the left, these people hold more extreme positions than average voters do. And I think that you can see that, popular primaries have pushed clearly. That was responsible for the rise of the Tea Party and the eradication of all of these moderate Republicans who faced Tea Party challengers. And in many cases, they would get elected in the primary and then face a Democrat and lose because they were so right of center. But that didn't prevent that from happening. And now I think any moderate Democrat, any moderate, center left or center, well, especially on the center right, politician really has to fear that. So there are other institutional factors, I think, that are contributing to this.
But on the identity, there is another identity phenomenon that I think that you mentioned in passing, but there are cases where this emphasis on identification actually leads to the kind of consolidation of democratic feeling, which was absent before. And I would argue certainly that the 2014 Euromaidan in Ukraine, obviously, probably created the Ukrainian national identity, made it something that was liberal democratic facing, that basically eschewed the kind of authoritarian oligarchic positions of the Yanukovych regime. And so, in my own experience with Ukraine over 25 years has been that people feel far more Ukrainian and also identify feeling Ukrainian as being a European calling rather than I don't know what the alternative would be, but in any case, a more provincial one. And we see the process being repeated where, in fact, the Belarusian nation is being forged right now, oddly enough, by the thugs of Lukashenko, attacking people who have a red-white flag. And I think it would be even more ideological in the sense of sort of pro-European if the European Union actually did something about it. But here the European Union is equally weighed down by institutional rules that allow one small country to veto any kind of sanctions against Lukashenko or Belarus. But we do see those are two cases of national identities in the past 6 years really being forged in the crucible of a fight against authoritarianism. I find that also this kind of, shouldn't always downplay nationalism because it can be also positive.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so that's an important point to emphasize. Identity is inevitable. We need identities and we want identities. They just have to be the right identities. And so you want a national identity because you need to have a common set of narratives and values that support your democratic political institutions. What you don't want is the wrong sort of identity. You don't want a nationalism that is exclusive, that says it's only members of this particular racial or ethnic group or this particular religion that are full members of our society. You don't want it to be aggressive internationally. You don't want a nationalism that says, we're better than our neighbors and therefore we have a right to intervene in their affairs. But you do need a nationalism that says, we are democratic, we support rule of law, we want to include, everybody. The fights over national identity, I think, have been important. In the United States, before the Civil War in the 1860s, we had a national identity that was based on race because only white men could vote in elections. And, the war was a very bloody struggle, but at the end you passed the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments that abolished slavery, that applied the law to everyone born on the territory of the United States. So it was a birthright citizenship, and you required, elections to be open. Now, unfortunately, given the later politics of trying to reincorporate the southern states, a lot of that was rescinded and really didn't get fulfilled until the civil rights era in the 1960s. But it was really a fight over identity. Is a black person worthy of the same degree of citizenship and rights as a white person? And our national history, in a sense, has been the building on the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, to actually include everybody, to include African Americans, to include Native Americans, to include women, and so forth. And, that's a progressive story that plays out over, a couple of centuries, right. And, often very violently. But if you don't have this sense of national identity, basically what you end up with is like Bosnia or Syria or Iraq, where you have these different identity groups that are living within a common political entity, but don't really feel any particular loyalty to the entity as a whole. They feel a loyalty to their particular group. And, the national politics is a matter of allocating resources between these different competing identity groups. And that's just not a healthy way to organize a democracy.
What we see happening, though, today, that, due to technology, is kind of an atomization of national identity based on self-choice, or I'm going to choose to be in this group, this bubble. I'm going to I choose all of these Facebook groups, sites that meet with my approval, and you end up creating a different kind of identity that I think that is only possible in a technological era. I mean, to take the extreme case, I think the U.S. has had Nazis in it ever since before World War II even, but the counts were like, okay, 3,000 across the United States with a slight concentration in Illinois, at least in the Blues Brothers, but anyway. You have, but they never met, or maybe, okay, they might have some little screed that they would share among each other and you could subscribe to. Whereas now, with the internet, you can just become a Nazi very easily. That's not there are all kinds of different identities, and we see at least the QAnon sort of whatever it is, I'm not sure, but certainly has gotten millions of people already behind it. And now you have a QAnon movement in almost every country in Europe today. I'm not sure what they have in common, aside from calling themselves QAnon, since they're, it's hard to take a French view of things and have it meet up with an American nationalist cult. But nonetheless, the point is that I think we are seeing with the issue of identity that the technological effects of this may take this to places we cannot foresee. If you think back to, 2011 in Tahrir Square, there was all of this positive, everyone said, look, the internet is democratizing the Middle East. Well, it turned out instead it led to, aside from Tunisia, basically disasters almost everywhere else. And where's not in on Tunisia, but at least they didn't become a disaster. Now, where is this where do you think all of the kind of identity issues are going to go with the easy availability of the internet to forge ever newer groups?
By the way, I do think that there still is a lot of positive things that happen because of the internet. So it's much easier to mobilize pro-democratic forces and for them to communicate. I suspect these demonstrations in Belarus every Sunday are probably being organized on Telegram or
right, yeah.
Some other internet-enabled app. And that would be very difficult to do, a century ago
right.
when you didn't have those kinds of technologies. That being said, I think the problem isn't just that all these neo-Nazis are able to find each other. I think that, the social media platforms actively encourage this kind of conspiracy thinking because they are creating these algorithms that are trying to maximize viewer engagement, and that is in their business interest, and that's led them to not just be neutral purveyors of bad stuff, but active promoters of it.
Yeah.
I think that's really kind of the challenge that we face. Yeah, the QAnon thing is very, it's changing very rapidly because, when this first surfaced, maybe last year sometime, I remember reading about it and thinking, well, this is still a really fringe phenomenon because, it had really started on 4chan, this relatively small platform, and then 4chan shut it down, and then it moved to 8chan, and it seemed like it would remain really at the fringes, but somehow it's gotten much more play than that. I think partly it gets into the mainstream media and people start, realizing it. And with QAnon, I think the fact that it's not that easy to actually find out about it makes it more attractive to some people because they see, yes, there really is a conspiracy and all these forces are trying to keep me from, having this secret knowledge, but now I've discovered it. But, there's been some recent poll data that has suggested that, a majority of Republicans believe some version of
Right.
QAnon. And, you just have to emphasize how crazy this stuff is. I mean, that, there are tunnels under Washington, D.C., in which children are being cannibalized and Democrats are drinking their blood. I mean, this is
Yeah.
stuff that is, there's some conspiracy theories that are at least half plausible, but this stuff is so
Right.
out of control, and it's, it really makes you wonder about democracies, if they're susceptible to this sort of um, uh, well, actually, I was in a discussion actually with he's a kind of conservative that's turned quite anti-Trump. He lives in Tennessee, so he says he's kind of living in the belly of the beast. And, his explanation for why this has taken off is really hatred. That, on the right, there's this combination of hatred and fear of the Democrats that has been stoked over a
Right.
long period of time. And he says, if you really hate and fear your enemies to this extent, you'll basically want to believe anything,
Right.
that is negative about them. And that, leads you then to suspend judgment about whether, this theory is actually plausible or true. And, unfortunately, with a number of people, that's the point to which they've gotten.
Well, it strikes me as, I mean, one thing which I think has been playing a role here, at least what I've turned to, is Nietzsche's idea of ressentiment. He says, we don't have a German word for that, so we'll use the French word, which I thought was cute, but which is kind of envy plus hatred, which is, I mean, is clearly there. On the other hand, the whole conspiracy side reminds me of Thomas Pynchon's Crying of Lot 49 and the Tristero, where you start seeing these connections and putting them together, which you don't really know if there is anything there. But it is gathering a lot of support with members of, or candidates for Congress. General Flynn comes out and does some kind of oath to where goes one, go all, or whatever. I mean, I don't know. It's being stoked. I hope, well, I guess eventually something will become clear, but the culty aspects of this also make me a little worried. I mean, it's like this kind of divine truth almost about things that are just go against the grain of science. But here, well, we can hope that technology will also try to help us out in getting rid of that, even though it's spreading it about. Well, I think we're running out of time because you're gonna have to go teach a class. And on behalf of the Lennart Meri Conference, we thank you. We couldn't get you here when it was when we were still in the real world, and now at least we finally got you in the virtual world. And then whenever all of this COVID nonsense is over, perhaps we can sort of make up for that and get you here, since we've had so many people from Stanford here over the years, but you're one person who we've always wanted. So say hello to Stanford.
Very good. Well, I look forward to that. I would like to visit again.